Well, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us for a Zoom live stream conversation with award-winning photographer, amazing human being, Vanessa Charlot. My name is Claudia Pretelin. I am a Mexican art historian, independent researcher, curator, and the founder of Instruments of Memory, a small but growing community based here in Los Angeles, California, that seeks to promote the work of women through in-depth conversations, exhibitions, and programming with different community partners. As a community of women in the arts, our primary focus is understanding how individuals and groups remember and interpret memories through contemporary art practices. Our most recent exhibition is called Memorias y Resistencias, Artistas, Mujeres, Artistas, Historias Afrolatinas y Caribeñas. This exhibition is in collaboration with 3 Latin American curators, Claudia Mandel Katz, Adriana Palomo, and Susie Vargas. And it features the work of emerging and established women artists who have documented stories of the African diaspora and Afro-descendants in Latin America. I invite you to visit the exhibition if you haven't done so, and on our website, instrumentsofmemory.com, and learn more about the artists featured, including the work of Vanessa, who kindly joins us today for a conversation about her work. Before I read just a brief part of Vanessa's bio, I'd like to, again, remind all participants to mute their devices during the conversation. At the end, we will have a Q&A. Just please make sure to share your questions via chat too, or we'll give you the time to participate too. Vanessa Charlot is a Haitian-American photographer, filmmaker, professor, curator, and media safety trainer. Her work focuses on the interdisciplinary intersectionality of race, politics, culture, and sexual gender expression to explore the collective human experience. Her photographs have been commissioned by numerous publications, including the New York Times, the New Yorker, the Washington Post, among many, many others. Welcome, Vanessa. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So before we talk about the series included in our exhibition, and for those who are not familiar with your work and background, I like to start with the story of how you found and became interested in photography, which I love. And here I want to bring the words of Graciela Iturbide, Mexican photographer that I work with for a few years. And she said that the camera was an excuse to see and know the world. You've said in previous conversations and interviews that it was your mom who gave you your first photographic camera. And the question will be, do you feel that as a little girl behind the lens, the photographic device also became an excuse to learn more about your immediate world?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think at the time I didn't realize how powerful the camera was. My mother was putting herself to nursing school, and she didn't want me to go to the neighborhood school. I grew up in Miami, Florida, in an enclave of immigrants where there was a plethora of Haitians, Dominicans, Cubans, et cetera. And so growing up in this very immigrant community in Miami, it was always about work, right? Hustle and bustle, just get through the day. And so that was very much my lived experience as well. And my mother heard of an art school. And so she proceeded to go to the local pharmacy and get me, and I'm totally gonna age myself right now, a disposable camera. And she gave me the disposable camera and she was like, well, go outside and make pictures. And because I grew up in this neighborhood, I knew the store owners. I knew the guys in the corner that were driving the taxis. I knew all of them. And the camera, in a way, created a protective barrier for me to observe and to externalize the things that I deem to see important. So oftentimes as photographers, we render certain things visible. And the things that we render visible is based on where we point our camera and where our gaze centers, right? And so for me, my gaze centered on looking at the everyday lives of folks in the diaspora that was learning, or better yet, that was looking to make sense of this new space and environment that they found themselves in.
That's so interesting. Part of my research while I was doing writing my master's and PhD thesis was about Kodak camera. So I'm kind of curious if your disposable camera was a Kodak camera for once. And then the other one is that part of my research is that I never saw any women of color represented on advertising, you know, like right. consuming those type of devices. But of course, there were many. It's just that they were not there, right?
No, yeah, absolutely. Like when you look at the historic ads of the Kodak camera, right? And I want to say the first ad came out in the 1920s. And so they were exploring this quote unquote new woman. And this new woman had the ability to go out into different spaces to make photographs. She was unaccompanied and she was a white woman, right? And so that didn't really reflect the lived realities of Black and brown women during that time. And so the ideation was to democratize photography. But if you look at the work of Dr. Deb Willis, Black folk have been creating photographs since the 1840s, right? But we just were not seen as image makers. And we know that image makers yield and wield a certain level of power, right? Because then you get to control your narrative. And you get to highlight the kind of stories that you deem to be important.
Yeah. And the I mean, when I was looking at those ads, like the camera, like you said, it also allowed women, you know, like to be able to see the world mediated by the device, right? Mm-hmm. So I think that's, I mean, the fact that there are no brown or Black women seeing on those ads, taking photographs, it doesn't, you know, like, it's one thing, but it's also like for those women, like the camera became a way, you know, like to interact with the public space, you know?
No, absolutely, right? Yeah. Because it's a tool that is outside of the subject or outside of the creator, that becomes universal.
Right.
And so it's this interesting play of power, I think, when you're looking at who's holding the camera and who's depicted. Women, irrespective of where we are typically the ones that carry on oral tradition, right? Like we carry on stories. When you talk to your grandmother or your mother, or whoever, they hold so much knowledge within themselves. And so even though it wasn't Black and brown women that were the ones that were seen on the ads, I still found it incredibly powerful to just imagine myself at that time as a young Black girl from Miami being the one to make photographs as well.
Yeah. And I remember there's this slogan, it's called "Let Kodak keep the story." Mm-hmm. You know, like, and it's like women are the ones that keep the story, right? Like we're the ones that keep the memories, like you were saying before, the traditions. So yeah, so that's I'd love to have that image of yourself in my, you know, like in my mind with your little camera.
Walking around. Yeah, that was totally me. And I was like 12 years old at the time. That was the first time.
Wow. And were you ever, or maybe because you were 12 years old, like you never felt this, you know, like self-conscious about like you looking at other people? Maybe it was something more natural for you at the time. And
yeah, absolutely. I think because I first started photographing in my own community. So the individuals that I photographed looked like me. They looked like my mom, my dad, my grandma, right? So these were people that I knew.
Yeah.
I had a rapport with. It wasn't a situation where I helicoptered into a community that would, like in terms of images, give me the kind of images, the salacious images that would garner attention. Instead, these were people that I knew.
Yeah.
And I think that it makes my work particularly, and I've seen the work of a lot of other photographers that I'm really moved by. But for me, in my work, you see the level of intimacy, and
Yeah.
it's on purpose, right? I want to go beneath the skin. I want to go very deep to make people really think about who are the images or who are the subjects in the images.
Right. And I think in our previous conversation, we talked about a little bit about the decisive moment. And I had this question for you, like also speaking about trust, like how do you establish trust with your photographic subjects, and how do you balance that decisive moment with a moment of trust and vulnerability?
Yeah, so when I'm working on longer form projects, it's a slow grind. I like to take my time. I'm not in a rush. It kind of feels like I'm peeling layers of an onion, so to speak, right? So I'm really engaging in deep conversation, not just with the subject, but with myself. I'm always thinking about my intention behind the work. Why am I photographing this person? Why do I think it's important to highlight this story? And so by doing that and rendering myself vulnerable to the subject, it creates a very collaborative process. There isn't a photograph that I have out in the world that a subject is not comfortable with having them out in the world.
Mm-hmm.
And it is because I want to ensure that they're depicted to the rest of the world in a way that makes them proud, right?
Yeah.
So I think that when you have that level of intentionality when it comes to the subject, then oftentimes people begin to show more of themselves to you.
Mm-hmm.
Simultaneously, you're showing more of yourself to them, and you're learning more about yourself as an artist.
Right. Yeah. And I think, we had these questions prepared, and we've talked about it a little bit, but you've said before that the camera can be a weapon to process trauma and also a tool of liberation. And as a woman with the mixed Caribbean heritage, I wonder if you can talk a little more about how your background has informed your gaze and the themes that you choose to photograph.
Well, yeah, sure. My family comes from the island of Hispaniola, right? And I was raised by a Haitian mother. And so when you think about the dominant narrative of Haiti is that it is the poorest country in the Western Hemisphere, right? And so because of that, it is devoid of context. It is completely dehumanizing, and it's a lazy story, to be honest, right? Because it strips so much culture and pride and language away from the group of people that live there. And so with that, now photographing here in the States and in diaspora communities, I'm always thinking about stereotypical tropes that other people face, that my own background has had to endure. And that really propels the kind of photographs that I take, right? Like, I don't want anything stereotypical. There's nothing new about seeing, let's say, the migrant woman who was selling oranges on the side of the highway, right? There's nothing new about that. But
Right.
like, do you follow her? She may be a mother of 4. There's so much more to her, right? Like, is she reading bedtime stories at night to her children? There's a lot more to explore there, and that is the impetus behind it.
Yeah.
And that's what creates the themes, quite honestly, in the work that I make.
Yeah, and you can really see that on your photographs, I feel, and I think that's why people feel very connected to your work, like it's something that goes to the image immediately. I want to talk about now the images are included in the exhibition. Describe your series, Black Woman's Shadow, as an intimate view into the psyche of a Black woman as she grapples with trauma, her anguish, fear, and loneliness. Could you talk about the process of making this series?
Absolutely. As a woman artist, we go into places, I think, that we may never share publicly, but we all universally feel. And so I wanted to externalize those emotions by collaborating this work with someone that was living in St. Louis with me at the same time during the height of civil unrest in the streets with George Floyd, right? And so what everyone else saw in the streets was Black and brown people in the streets, right? Like, but what about when they go home? And even outside of civil unrest, just the day-to-day grind, when we go home, what does that look like? When we're by ourselves and we're having these array of emotions and we're grappling with very deep emotional or mental anguish that no one sees, but it's heightened because of our womanness, maybe our race, our sexual orientation, what have you. And I photographed the Black woman's shadow, a lot of the photographs in the shower. And it is because for me, that is my meditative place. But it is also a place where I go to cry, right? And I go to process. And no one really gets to see you like that, right? Like that raw, that vulnerable. Because we also know as women, when you go out into the world, it's showtime, right? Like you have to be strong and you have to be all of these things. And I wanted us, irrespective of race, to see ourselves and say that it's okay to feel those things and be in those spaces, because these are universal emotions that we all feel.
Yeah, no, that's what it was. I didn't know this series. I think when I learned about your work, I knew about the fire next time, and when I saw these images, I thought that was a very, very intimate portrait of your life that it seems like only women are able to do when photographing themselves. I don't think I've seen something so intimate, like coming from a male photographer. And when you say that it's how you grapple with trauma, fear, and loneliness, and this image for me is hope. Like
Right.
you're able to go back to your hope and what you believe and your family and your heritage and all of that. It's right there. And I just feel that, like not everything is as terrible as we see it when we have someone to go back and love.
No, absolutely. And that's what keeps us going, right? Look, like it's human to feel all of those things, but you still have to find your anchor, or hopefully you find your anchor and you find your reason why. So why do you keep going? And so in this image, it's a precious image between a mother and a son. And you see her having very visceral reactions, right? So in Black Woman's Shadow, you see her in the tub. She's completely naked. That is on purpose. It is because in those times we render ourselves bare to ourselves, right? Like we're really trying to grapple with very uncomfortable truths. The other thing is that I was intentional about choosing a woman whose body does not necessarily fit the stereotypical mold of what beauty standards are, right? And to really challenge these ideas around what kind of women get to express what. So when you're looking at a woman who is a little bit more voluptuous, there's oftentimes this very false ideation that she needs to be super tough, right? Because she's a bigger girl and all these things, but that's not necessarily fair. And does it make sense to relegate her to this ideation that she too cannot be a woman in distress? So like the idea of a damsel in distress means it has to be a specific kind of woman. And also we are typically uncomfortable with women of color expressing our pain or our rage or our sadness, because women, I think particularly women of color, are expected to be strong and withstand it all. But that is a myth, right? It's not true. And at the end of Black Woman's Shadow, even though she's feeling all those things, she still is able to find her anchor, and her anchor being her son.
Yeah, I have a different question, but I think it was coming later. But I'd like to talk about your aesthetic choices when it comes to taking photographs, because I'm seeing this, and here it made me think about Octavio Paz, the Mexican writer and also Nobel Prize recipient, who once said that reality is more real in black and white. And I wanted to know, how do you decide on which photographs to take in black and white and which to take in color?
Yeah, so for the most part, I lean towards black and white. It is my aesthetic preference because one, like that's just how I learned how to work. Two, the photographs that stand out most to me are typically done in black and white. I love the timelessness of it. I think that the things that I try to grapple with in my work are things that have existed since the beginning of time. And so I want to render time irrelevant in some ways. And I think black and white does that. And it also forces you to focus on the subject. I do have another piece of work or a project called Pieces of Him. And with Pieces of Him is actually done in color. And the reason why it's done in color is because I'm photographing a little Black boy, and I wanted for the colors to be soft, right? And to be precious. And hopefully to just remind us of the beautiful innocence of children. And I think that color was able to do that in a way that I think black and white would not have been. Just because the composition and the coloration in black and white is oftentimes lots of shadows, dark hues, in juxtaposition to lighter ones. And it doesn't always leave a lot of space for your mind and your feelings to just go off.
Yeah. Yeah, those images, we don't have them here, but you can go to Vanessa's website. It's a beautiful series. The colors are, they remind me of Gordon Parks' work.
Yeah.
I don't know. And talking about your influences, who are the photographers that do you see other people's photographs before you start a project, or is it something that you think it's there in your mind, and then sometimes when you want to do a specific series, you kind of like want to honor or replicate something about it?
So interestingly enough, there are a handful of photographers that I actually study, right? Gracilia being one of them, Maggie Stieber, C.W. Griffin, Chester Higgins, Sebastião Salgado, and the other one escapes me. But I heavily lean on literary artists. So for example, I love James Baldwin, Toni Morrison, Octavia Butler, Gabriel Marquez, like people like that create, I don't know, I feel like literary works gives me the space to look at the world in which I'm living in differently. And so then I began to think about things that I want to seeing an image. And it's almost serendipitous in a way that I begin to see those things manifest out in the world. Because oftentimes these writers are either talking about what is or what they hope to be. And I hope, and I kind of shape my ideations around that.
Yeah, that's really, really interesting, particularly with this coming series that we're gonna talk about. And speaking of which,
he is a literary genius. You know what else? I also listen to a lot of jazz. So Billie Holiday also shapes, and John Coltrane, and music that was created in the 1920s during the Harlem Renaissance also shapes.
That's so interesting. How do you like? And we're gonna talk about something that you're gonna do leaving after this conversation, a little bit if you were willing, but how do you mentally prepare to take those photographs? Like, are you listening to music on your way to your next assignment, or before, like the night before, do you go to bed and read something? If you can talk about that.
Yeah. So interestingly enough, I either have James Baldwin in my ear, one of his lectures, or Toni Morrison, or I'll have John Coltrane playing A Love Supreme. And the reason why I play the song A Love Supreme is because I think that as artists, whatever we create is a labor of love, right? And so I want to be completely rooted and squared in that space. But for Fire Next Time, I listened to James Baldwin every day for about 4 months, because I was in the streets of St. Louis every day for 4 months.
Okay, yeah, that takes me to the next question that we talk about. When did you encounter this book, the two essays by Baldwin first, and how did they impact you as a Black woman?
So I remember taking an African American literature class in college, and we had to read Fire Next Time. And Fire Next Time struck me because it's broken up into 2 essays. And the first essay, James Baldwin is having a conversation with his nephew, who is also called James Baldwin, right? And he's having this conversation about not allowing what he sees out into the world to color his perceptions of himself. And so the second conversation, or the second essay, is about him talking about these moral institutions, right? So these religious places that are supposed to be the foundational building block for morality in a society. And so it made me aware of the fact that we exist in 2 worlds simultaneously. There's our world, us, right, as individual worlds. And then there's the world that we go out and live in. And so how do you make sense of your world first, you yourself, in order to live in this larger context? It's kind of like we are individual trees within a forest, right? And so with that, I began to think about, okay, me as an artist that is covering this, and I have all of my own historical ideas and my culture and my background and my experiences and how I will view this situation. And then there is what's really happening in the streets of St. Louis, right? And this project, St. Louis, exists in the shadows of the Ferguson uprising after the death of Mike Brown. So the racial tension is there, right? It's a very difficult place to be in. But I am also aware that my family is not African American, right? We're from the Caribbean. And so the way that I view things are a little bit different. I also like the myth making in terms of the storytelling of how I have shaped my identity through my own community is not one that my Blackness is inferior, right? being from Haiti and us being the first free Black republic, like that is our story, always. And so to be in a space where I center my identity on liberation, and to be in the midst of other people who look like me that are fighting for their right to exist in this space, was deeply conflicting. And so I thought Fire Next Time really spoke to the idea that as artists, we have ourselves and all the things that we're grappling with, and we're trying to respond to the larger world. And it is the role of the artist to speak to the reality of the times, right? And Nina Simone talks about that. Like, that is our responsibility. And so how do I do that in a way that really challenges the idea that history is told from the position of the victim and not the victor, or the victor and not the victim? And how do I not just victimize the people that are in the streets, but how do I instead make this story about people who are affirming their lives and their right to exist in a city that systematically ignores that? So I definitely use a Haitian liberation lens to photograph that, right? Like I did not, if you look through the work, I do not highlight people really getting arrested. There's nothing new about that. Instead, I highlight very strong women, because we know that women are the pulse of the movement. When you think about the civil rights movement, when you think about apartheid in South Africa, like, who was the ones behind the scenes that made things happen, right? And that is where my focus went.
Yeah, you can. I mean, there's this other image of you and of the same series where there's this. I think it's a woman holding a photograph.
Mm-hmm.
I don't talk about that in particular.
So that woman is Leslie McSpadden. She is the mother of Mike Brown. And one, it was incredibly difficult to make that photograph because I can only imagine what this woman went through. The other thing, though, was typically when you see photographs of Leslie McSpadden, she is in raw form, right? She just lost her son. She's crying in the streets. Like, you don't really get to see the beauty of this woman. And you don't get to see the relationship between her and her son. And so even before I began to make pictures of Leslie McSpadden, I spent time with her, and I really allowed her to lead the conversation, because I think that when you're photographing Black and Brown communities, immigrant communities, people in the Caribbean, you know, there's a way that the media presents us, and I want to listen to what the people find most important and allow them to guide certain things. And so that's what I did with Leslie. And then it was right before I was going to leave. Leslie was like, well, do you want me to take a picture with me and my son? And so she brought out the picture of Mike Brown, and I took it in front of her house. And even before I took the photograph, you know, she was intentional about being very well dressed. And I really appreciated that, because I really wanted to challenge all the other images of her that presents her as this very irrational, emotional woman.
Yeah, it's you're really honoring that, you know, like humanity that we all, you know, like have and want to see when, you know, like we want our communities to be photographed too. So
Yeah.
Beautiful image of Leslie. You've talked about going out to the streets and taking your camera and talking to people, but I know there were some challenges for you to photograph during the protest, and I would love to talk to you about it, because it's happening everywhere. You will think that the United States it's a more free. There are more freedom of expression here, but you know, like coming from Mexico, you see all the harassment that exists to Mexican and photographers. So if you can share your experience with us.
Well, photographing in St. Louis was difficult. I probably served in the United States Army, so I'm a veteran. And I knew how to navigate in civil unrest, but I experienced being tear gassed, police shooting, the hostility with the Proud Boys coming to certain places. I distinctly remember being in front of one of the police stations, and one of the police officers shot someone. And it was interesting because the person that he shot was a part of the new Black Panther Party. But at the same time, the Proud Boys were there. And they didn't receive the same level of harassment. So that was a part of the experience. And look, the reality is that there are brilliant photographers and artists in different places that are creating brilliant work. And when you are making work as an artist that is speaking to social and political movements, unfortunately, it comes with some kind of risk. And it is difficult to fathom that, for me specifically as a veteran who fought for this country, to have to come back home to fight again. But because the work that I'm producing, I hope, will continue to exist beyond me, I find it to be worth it. I want for folks in the diaspora to be able to see images that reflect the beauty and humanity of who we are, right? And the contributions that we make in this space that our parents have decided to come to, or that we have decided to come to.
Yeah, in that sense, we mentioned during the introduction that you are a media safety trainer. So for those who are not familiar with this, I don't know if you could speak about the work that you do with the International Women's Media Foundation.
Yeah, so I work with the IWMF. I also work with New York Times, Vice News, Reuters, different large media outlets whose journalists are going into conflict. So training journalists to get ready to go to Ukraine, for instance, Northern Africa, the Caribbean right now. And I do that also with the lens of intersectionality when it comes to race and gender, right? So what a woman photojournalist in the field will experience may be different from what a male would. And then what a Black woman, like for example, for me, myself, covering stories in Mississippi is very different from what a white male may experience, right? And so understanding those parts of our identities, not necessarily as disadvantages, but things to be aware of and how to keep ourselves safe when doing those things. So most recently, I did a training for Reuters, and they were heading to Ukraine. And I was working with a few women and had them think about, like, okay, so not only your identity, but also the psychological impacts and the trauma of seeing war in real time. And there's no real way to prepare yourself to see that, right? But what are some things that you can do while you were there that hopefully it provides some kind of mitigation for you in terms of your mental health, your physical health, and ensure that you make it back home safe.
Such an important work. I didn't know what that was. I think I had seen a documentary about journalists in different countries, and now it makes sense what one of the people in there was doing. So thanks for that. I'm gonna close with this question. Photographs can provide an especially meaningful sense of connection for people whose lives are shaped by exile, immigration, and relocation. In your opinion, how can we use photography to find or create meaningful connections within our Black, Brown, Asian, or what people like to call minority communities to challenge the dominant visual stories?
Well, there's a few things that photography can do. I think one, when you're looking at photography as an artistic practice, it really challenges our preconceived notions about who gets to take up the frame, right? And who gets to show up on an image. There's that. And I think that is incredibly important. I also think that photographs are also visual markers of the fact that we were here. And so I often like to think about, not that I like to think about, but I liken it to this. If this civilization were to go away right now, what would remain?
Mm-hmm.
And photographs may be one of the things that remain. And if they remain, what will we say, or what will the photographs say about us, about what we found important, and about what shaped our own existence, right? And so I think that when you're looking at Black, Brown, Asian communities, who oftentimes are essential to shaping civilization, but are left out of the dominant narrative, it renders us invisible. And so photography gives us a medium to ensure that our collective experiences are included in the telling of that story, right? And it also rebalances the power of storytelling. Storytelling shapes how we understand ourselves, and that ultimately shapes our societies. But if the contributions of Black, Brown, and Asian communities are not a part of that, then we will continue to perpetuate a monotonous, dare I say, whitewashed society that does not include the rich tapestry of what it means to be someone from the diaspora.
Right. That's very, very important. I was looking at this reading American photographs book, and there's like all white guys. As historians, we also need to, like write about all their images and like, like bring those to our communities and show.
Yeah, like think about that's what we're going to study, right? So imagine being a little girl from Mexico and you never see anybody that looks like you.
Yeah.
Or that no one speaks Spanish, right? Or no one understands the importance of like Dia de los Muertos, right? Like no one really gets it. And so there are things that are happening in your textbooks that does not reflect your life. And so like, what does that say to you? Does it say that you don't matter? That you don't exist? Like, what is that? Right. And so I think it's the responsibility of the photographer, especially if you're from that community, to ensure that that doesn't happen. And from that vein, it's more than just you, it's for those that will come after you.
Yeah. So Vanessa, thank you so much. I don't know if you want to share with us before I open the dialogue to other questions from the audience, if you can share what are your next projects and what are you doing immediately after our conversation?
Well, immediately after our conversation, I'll be heading to Memphis, Tennessee. Unfortunately, as we know, Tyree Nichols was killed by 5 police officers in the streets of Memphis. And so I'm going to go up there and photograph what's happening and see if there's a way to highlight or raise the profile of certain voices. Because like this is just a huge problem in our country. And so that's what I'm actively working on, like within the next 15 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you so much again for your time. And if I think I saw someone raise their hand. Veronica, I think you raised your hand and had a question for Vanessa. If you want to unmute your microphone and join the conversation, or if someone else has a question, just please let us know. Carolina, you had a question? Okay.
Okay, first of all, thank you for the space. I appreciate this beautiful space that you have, Claudia and Vanessa. I really admire your work and your powerful words. It's been great to know your work more in depth. So please forgive my English.
No, it's okay.
And first of all, I want to know where can we see your work? So if you could please share your website with us, and if there's something you want to highlight, like a series or a portfolio, please share that with us. And second, I'm curious if I understand that you work on assignment, but in your personal work or your artistic work, do you or have you worked like with your ancestry, your roots, your home country? I'm curious about that.
Oh my God, I love that question. So let me try to answer it in order. My
Okay.
website is vanessacharlot.com. And so there's about 6 or 7 projects on there.
Okay.
I have worked extensively on African spiritual practices. So looking at voodoo, looking at Santeria, looking at different practices that I think are oftentimes not told in a way that speaks to the complexity of the spiritual system. And it is often demonized. And so there's a little bit of work that I show on the website called The Gatekeepers. And so that looks at the convergence of voodoo and Catholicism and how that shows up in the Americas. And as we know, especially if we're from Latin countries, we all have like the indigenous and then Catholicism, and then it comes together and then we try to make sense of it all, right? And so I have worked on that. And it's quite personal to me because my family still practices, those that live in Haiti and in the Dominican Republic. And so I knew that as they become more modernized, certain things, certain rituals, certain dances and things like that may go away. And so I've been photographing and videotaping and doing audio of ritual ceremonies. So in Haiti, in the Dominican Republic, and here in America. Yeah. Thank you so much for that question.
Thank you, Vanessa.
Before I give Cynthia an opportunity to share her question, Vanessa, wanted to tell you that Carolina is one of the artists in the exhibition too.
Okay.
She's been photographing the Muskogo community at the north of Mexico. So
Really? Yeah. Oh my gosh. Okay, so where can I find? Okay, well, send me a message.
I will.
Okay, Cynthia, if you want to share your question, and then I'll read Veronica's comment on our chat.
Thank you. The work is absolutely incredible.
Thank you.
Really. And Claudia, thank you so much. This is how I know about the work. This conversation is really wonderful, but I wanted to ask you specifically about your background as a veteran and how that has applied to your work domestically. With our domestic wars here.
No, absolutely.
In Memphis.
Yeah.
Wow.
So I love that question. I served in the United States Army and I branched aviation. And so a lot of what I did in the military was about strategic planning, and that part isn't as interesting, right? But it is. But application to my work is that, you know, when I was being trained to respond to hostility in another country. And so I think oftentimes as Americans, we don't realize that it's hostile here, and that it is dangerous here, right? And so a lot of the things that we would prepare for in other places, you have to do similar preparations in this country. And I think particularly if you're not from what is deemed a marginalized community, it is easy for you to be unaware of that, right? So, for example, the idea of me having a face of Proud Boys was not shocking to me. There was nothing that was like, oh my God, I can't believe that happened, right? Like, I'm very clear as to where I am and who I am. But it also really helped me to be able to look for things that most people would overlook when telling stories, right? So because I've been trained to look for people who are unassuming, but extremely powerful. And that is very important because oftentimes, just like as someone from the families from the Caribbean, the most unassuming person in the space is typically the most influential person in the space. Now that contradicts how we are in the Western world, like in America, right? So like the person with the largest ego oftentimes is the person that is most influential. But because in the Caribbean, there are socioeconomic factors, it is not always beneficial for you to be that person. And so with the military training, knowing how to move strategically in spaces and knowing how to cover civil unrest, I'm able to pinpoint who was the most powerful organizer and get stories from them. I am able to figure out like when is somewhere going to get dangerous, when it's not going to be dangerous, when the outside community or the media presents it as dangerous, but it's really not, right? Like, so there's all these things that really shape how I approach the work. But domestically, here's what's been the good thing. Because I'm a veteran, I know how to speak to, so right now I'm living in Mississippi, right? I know how to speak to rural white men. And I know the language to use, right? Because I serve, so I can talk about weapons and I can talk about all these things and I can come in with an Army hat and it doesn't completely neutralize it, but it makes them a little bit more comfortable. And then with that, I'm also able to produce work and have certain conversations that I don't think that they would have if I wasn't who I was, right? Like there's certain conversations that they may not have to just a regular person of color. So that has been powerful, I think, in my work. Like it has given me the ability to cross over many barriers.
That's so interesting. And again,
you know, the other thing, and I'm sorry, and I just thought about this. The other thing too is that it has actually helped me understand, even if I don't agree, certain ways of thinking. So I understand why, let's say, the rural white guy feels like he's been left out and why he's been ignored. And like, I may not agree, but I get it, right? And so the military has actually done that as well, just because me interacting with people from all over the country.
yeah,
Question.
that's interesting. I wonder if you can share that a little more about it, like.
Yeah. So, in the military, because you have to be in relationship with all kinds of people, right? Like they're either your soldiers or they're your supervisors or what have you, you get to know them quite intimately. Also because you guys are depending on each other to stay alive. And so you begin to have certain conversations that you may not have had in another space. And because when you're not having these conversations, it creates a silo. And so it's like an echo chamber and everybody is repeating the same thing. But when you have another conversation with someone else and you realize like many of the socioeconomic barriers that you may face as a person of color in this country, there may be rural, white, poor people in other spaces that are experiencing it, right? So poor schools. There isn't fresh food. There's a food desert here. There's a food desert in Detroit, right? Like a lot of things, you begin to see similarities. And even though there's definitely racial tension, like I'm not going to skip over that. But both of you are able to see that a lot of the lived experience that you're having is not particular to you. It's something that is shared with multiple people across race.
Yeah. Yeah. Before reading the last question, Cynthia is also an artist and activist based in Dallas, and she's also part of one of our exhibitions feature called Unspoken. Cynthia, I don't know if you want to talk real quick about it.
Yes, it's actually wonderful. This is how I met Claudia. But so an East Coast writer organized an exhibition that included stories about abortion.
Oh,
And
wow.
this was all in the lead up to the overturning. I'm trying to remember the timeline, but anyway, very powerful. And then it was paired with images that I had submitted of. So when the leaked document came out on Politico on May 2nd, I believe, I guess it was, I started making what I termed abortion bouquets for allies, friends, women, conceived, people that I knew, because it seemed evident that they were going to overturn Roe v. Wade. So the photographs were of women holding and others holding the bouquets. And I think I only did one male, which actually at the time it was the Beto who was running for governor of Texas, and he actually posed with one. And I was like,
wow.
yes. Because we had done a fundraiser in Dallas. But anyway, just, you know, we're here in Texas, you're in Mississippi, we know exactly what's happening in the South, and these rights that are just being decimated. And there's two recent lawsuits that were filed, one in Dallas, another one in Texas. I'm not sure if it was Austin or where, which are going after the FDA approval of the abortion pill medication. And that could have consequences for the entire country. So I'm here based in Dallas, feeling like we're just fighting it out here, because it's absolutely horrific what's happening, because it's, again, it's going to fall on marginalized and lower income communities that don't have access and don't have resources to what once was a constitutional right.
Absolutely.
So anyway, I was so grateful for Claudia to do the show. And it was just an online exhibition as well. But I'm feeling like I'm screaming in the dark here in Texas. Having an East Coast curator and a West Coast based nonprofit doing that was really, really helped me get through it. And we're still dealing with it now. So anyway, that's how I know Claudia.
Wow.
We're happy to share this space for all of these important causes. So Veronica is from west of Philadelphia, and she says, Vanessa, I wholeheartedly appreciate you and your artwork. I follow you and Sheila Pre-Bright in Atlanta for highlighting women and mothers of the movement. Is there anyone else I should follow right now?
I think you should follow. Her name is Raquel. I'm gonna butcher her last name. Her name is Raquel. She works for the Houston Chronicles. She's a Latina from California. Brilliant. There's Dee Dwyer out of DC. There is Layla Byron out of New York. Oh my God, their names are escaping me. But there's a few, those 3 or 4 that I mentioned. From there, like, you can go down a rabbit hole and then get connected to a whole bunch of other women that are doing great work.
Yeah, we'll definitely check on all of those works and connect everyone if we can, which is the intent of the space to create these networks and create this dialogue between women here and other countries too. So thank you so much, Vanessa. Please be safe, and we cannot wait to see your next project.
Thank you. All right. Y'all have a wonderful day.
Thank you. Bye, guys.
Bye.
Bye bye. Thank you.